Having covered all that, now what we want to be able to do is get into what is the learning outcome 2, to understand how formulation of policy is done and how the implementation of this policy or strategy, long-term planning, is done from an organizational standpoint of view. And there are 3 assessment criteria that we will cover. I've got about 28 slides, but I'm going to go through some of the slides or skip some of the slides, but the focus would be to look at understanding what is human resource planning process, because here we want to understand what is HRP. HRP essentially stands for Human Resources Planning, and this is a key thing which a lot of HR managers, do when they look at, preparing an annual plan, or, when they look at putting together a plan which basically talks about recruitment, selection, appraisals, reward management, performance management, and things like that. So that is one of the things that we will cover. The other thing that we will look at in particular would be to understand how do we assess the role of HR within the organization. Sometimes you will see the board of directors or the management essentially looks at the HR role and says the HR or HR personnel are not doing enough. That means they are not doing enough. Could be that they are not doing maybe things which are required to be done to move the organization forward, which is being looking at trimming, say for example, pay packages, salaries, looking at compensation, looking at benefits, how they are kind of benchmarking those against the other organizations. If the organization, in this case I'm talking about an example, if you start to lose employees and you lose valuable resources which are employees which have trained, which have stayed with you in the organization, have done the functions well or their roles and responsibilities well, but if the organization suddenly starts to lose some of that personnel, there is an introspection which starts to go in to see what is the role of HR which they are doing and why do you think the employees are leaving. So that could be one specific example. So here sometimes you'd see organizations doing a bit of introspection into the role of HR and what role do they play, how critical is that role, is done in terms of assessments. So let's look at getting into one or two important aspects, and as we go along, what we will do is discuss some of these things with examples. So having given you a bit of a background now, is it quite clear that you can look at say recollecting why do you think is HR important within an organization? Christina, Eve,
sorry?
Why do you think role of HR is important in an organization?
Why?
Yes.
Because without it, you wouldn't have any people to work there.
Right.
Yes, HR is the most important role. I've worked in HR quite a bit. It covers about the whole functioning of the operation, because without a decent HR department, your organisation just isn't going to function. You're not going to be kept clean, and you're not going to have any board of directors, and you won't have anybody in between. And all the people in between need to be motivated. They need to make sure that they've got proper contracts. They need to make sure that they're implementing all the policies of the company, that they understand the policies of the company, that they're all trained to a certain standard. It's probably one of the most important departments in any country, in any organisation.
Right. So if I just look at a different perspective on that, and when I say I know HR is important, so you've highlighted a couple of points, things like you basically mentioned a couple of things, but having to look at in terms of functions, what are the key functions which HR performs, which makes it important within the organization? Let me rephrase my question and ask you this way, that what you've described is okay, and that's descriptively what is the HR role and why is it important is understood. But my question, which I'm rephrasing now, is the fact that what are the key roles which HR actually performs within an organization which make it important? So let's look at it the other way around. What could be the key role? One of the key role is that it does performance appraisal. But what are the other key roles which the HR performs, which makes it important in the organization?
It ensures all the policies and procedures are in place to make sure that the organisation can operate properly and within the law,
right,
and within what the actual organisation wants to do, that they can meet its targets. If it doesn't have a workforce, it can't meet the targets or can't be driven. And in healthcare, it's very important you've got the right sort of training and the right sort of competencies, and you've got the right people coming through. And it also, they should all know what the mission statement is, especially in charities. Each charity has a mission statement, therefore that should be like the core implication of what everybody within HR does.
That's the idea, Krishna. I'll stop you there. Eve, do you have a different viewpoint? Do you want to add something to this?
No, I don't understand HR that much. I've never worked in it.
Right, okay. So if I just now I know Christina has mentioned a couple of things. Now I want to break it down. Reason being, what she has mentioned is a lot of things which HR does, but I want to break it down and pick out some keywords that I'm actually looking at in my question. So when we look at, and I'll give you a different, example. When I look at engineering as a layman's example, when I look at engineering, what is important in engineering is that you have staff, which understand what is to be done, and they have the requisite training and knowledge and skills to be able to perform that work. Now, if I have to take that to healthcare, and when I look at it from an HR perspective, one of the key things that they do when they recruit staff within the organization, so when I look at the key functions of HR, what is the key function of HR? They understand all this, what Christina said, but the first thing that they look at is when they look at, recruitment, that is the first function they do, because recruitment and selection has to be done by an HR person who understands the job description, the requirement in the organization, and has all the details of where the role will sit, what the compensation will be, how the job description would be, what kind of person with experience and qualities and skill set they want, and at some stage what training would that person require when they join the organization. So in terms of the key functions which HR does, I know what Christina said is absolutely correct, but one of the key functions when we look at the HR does, the functions are recruitment and selection, the functions are performance appraisal or management, the functions are when Christina said they break down the mission and vision and statements and make sure that all staff and employees have the same understanding on those policies and procedures. So there the function is they break down the company's key vision and mission statements into easily understandable policies and procedures. So basically policies and procedures. Then they also look at maintaining what are called or providing things like benefits. They look at employee motivation. They also look at training, which is one of the most important functions, and also look at grievance. If you have a problem, if you have a complaint, who do you go and complain within the company? You go to your line manager, yes, but if your line manager is not able to resolve, who do you go and complain or raise it to the next level? So in that next level, you go across to your human resources manager or somebody who is is responsible for employee management or the recruitment and selection process. So the person who is recruited, you go back to him and say, okay, I've had this problem, but I'm not comfortable going back to my line manager. So what they look at is HR managers also look after grievances and complaints within the organization to resolve them amicably so that you don't have lawsuits. And if the employee ends up leaving, they end up leaving, but when they end up leaving, they do an exit interview to get the feedback and learnings of where things have gone wrong. So when we look at the functions of HRM, to a certain extent, they give us the importance of that department within the organization. So going back to now, rewinding to what Christina mentioned initially, is the summary of why HR is required. Because if you don't have people, if you don't have somebody who manages them, don't have somebody who creates these structured policies and procedures and does not or do not have people who make everyone understand that the understanding has to be this as per the employee handbook or things like that, that role is performed by HR within the organization. Are you with me? Both of you, are you with me on that? Is that okay? Yeah?
Yes,
fine. Yes, yes.
So the importance, so now with understanding the functions, we understand what is the importance of that, department or that function within the organization. Now, having understood that, what we want to be able to do is understand what is the process. So the process of human resources planning. Now, in engineering, for example, if I again go back and dip into that example today, is that currently, say, 5G is being deployed in 5 cities in the UK. So there are lots of organizations which are deploying this network, but EE has become the first company to deploy that network in 5 cities. Now, they have gone through a particular process of deploying this technology and making it accessible to consumers. That process would have been the bidding process for the 5G spectrum, after the bidding process, shortlisting, meeting service level agreements, whatever it is. And at some stage, they started the deployment of that. And that deployment meant that, after a certain weeks, months, they have this network which is operational and this is available to customers. So when we look at the human resources process, when we look at the whole process of, recruitment, selection, appraisals, whatever we say, when we look at this, the bit which becomes important is that we need to identify how this process works from this departmental point of view. So here, the key bit when you look at recruitment, they want to recruit competent employees. You want employees with skill sets coming in. You want employees coming in with up-to-date knowledge. You don't want a novice coming into the organization. And in some cases, when you design job descriptions, you're designing the job description or the advert, which is put out to recruit people in a way that it meets the criteria and requirement of the job role for which the vacancy is being created. Are you with me on that?
Yes.
Yeah? So if you're looking at recruitment,
they also got all the job descriptions as well as all the job adverts, don't they?
Absolutely. So when you look at a care home, for example, if they were looking at recruiting a practicing nurse or a locum nurse, or for example a night duty officer, things like that, what you're going to do is define the clear roles and responsibilities of that person to ensure that the person that you recruit meets all the requirements of the role. And you are looking at that person coming in maybe with prior experience, looking at maybe that person jumping over from another organization. You're kind of getting an employee which is coming in at a bit of higher salary and a higher responsibility. And that person then is able to give a jump start because you're ensuring from start, when you do the recruitment and selection, that that person will have the basic requisites for them to come in and join the role and start performing from day one. Now, this starts off with the process, as I mentioned, which is planning. And what is planning? So here, an HR manager is expected to, look at planning everything. Say, for example, how many staff would be needed if the management sets a target that we are looking at meeting this quality standard, we are looking at meeting this target this year, or we're expanding the care home to accommodate 100 more people. Then at that stage, the planning process for HR actually starts. And the planning that they start doing is they do planning on resources. How do they recruit? How do they get people? What are the various needs the people will have? And how they will go out and systematically get the employees or the staff required to run this as a function. So they start planning this, and this process is primarily what is called the human resources planning process. You will normally see the HR managers doing this annual planning once a year. Once the management or the board sets the target, these targets are broken down and they pick up the targets and then they break it down further into individual roles and responsibilities which the employees will pick up so that the organization is able to achieve the overall target at the end of the year. So they look at doing all this planning, and that board plan, or the plan which the board actually gives, is broken down into something which is palatable and easier goals for employees to understand, because they break it down into roles and responsibilities. So I'll give you an example here. As a managing director of the organization, you might say that we want to increase our service levels to 98% this year, and we want to reduce our wait time to less than 20 minutes. You see the A&E services, the current wait time in the UK, when you look at England in particular, is 2 hours 48 minutes. In some of the hospitals and other places, the wait times are up to 4 hours. So the government has set a target that they want to reduce it down to about 2 hours, not more than 2 hours. Now that target has been set. How will that target be broken down into smaller targets, which will be becoming a KRA or a part of key result areas of employees working within that particular department to deliver those services, will actually be done by HR and the line manager. HR in conjunction with the line managers. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah. So that bit requires what is called planning, and that planning is done to basically look at assessing the current human resources capacity. It could be to look at also forecasting what are the number of people required to take up that role at a later stage. It could also mean the HR also identifies, or when I say HR, the human resources manager also identifies gap areas which they need to streamline so that these services could become more effective. They could also look at planning an overall strategy, because when we look at reducing the wait times from 4 hours to 2 hours, which is the target which the government has set, it wouldn't happen overnight. So the HR will have to put a plan in place, and that plan will have to be broken down into key result areas and integrate that with job descriptions or individual responsibilities of individuals involved in making that delivery happen. And that would require planning. Is that okay?
Yes.
Is that okay? Now let's look at, so I'm skipping through some of the slides because these slides, what I prepared is, these slides talk about this process. Now let's look at focusing on today recruitment and selection to understand the functions and the importance of HR. One of the things that we know that when we say an organization is going to put out an advert to recruit say 10 employees or say 2 employees, forget 10, just 2 employees. They've already prepared a few things before even the advert is put out. So they've prepared a job description. There's a clear idea available within the HR in terms of what the compensation would be, what kind of skill set they want, number of years of experience, how that role is benchmarked against a competitor in the market, and when they bring the person in, what kind of scrutinizing or a process through which the person will go before they accept somebody and offer a contract. So that process of recruitment, and then the second part of selection, when you start receiving the CVs, when the job advert is placed, after that you start receiving CVs or people start applying for the jobs, and then at some stage the HR managers, the line managers sit down and start looking at the process of selection. The selection process would involve interviews. In some cases, there are tests which are also done. You might have the candidate, depending on if they're joining in the management, you might have a psychometric test, you might have an aptitude test done, you might have a personality test done. In some cases, if they're joining at the frontline level, you might want to test the abilities of the employee on the basis of what they mentioned in the CV. And in some organizations, you will see that they will go through successive round of interviews. So the first level of interview checks on basic things. The second round would check on competency. The third round would look at checking on the management or the experience, which is primarily on the basis of key functions that the individual has performed. And at some stage, when you are more or less sure that the person meets the criteria, he or she meets the criteria, you will have maybe a final interview to confirm a couple of things which is related to compensation, package, benefits, the roles and responsibilities. And in some cases, some organizations also go through the job description in detail to make sure that the person coming into that role understands what they're going to do on a day in, day out basis, on a short, medium term basis, and in a long term, what is the plan. Are you okay with that?
Yes.
Yeah. And
yes.
when the HR then issues a contract, so you've come to a third stage now. First stage, adverts and things going out. Second stage, we're looking at doing selection through the interviews and other processes. Once that has happened, the stage then comes is when the organization issues a contract or an offer letter. And that offer letter basically ensures that it's a legal contract. It's a binding agreement which basically the employee has to sign. And when they sign, you ask the employee to bring certain things across, things like your educational transcripts, your 2 references, maybe your previous P45, various requirements come across. And that, when it is accepted, you then see the employee getting inducted into the organization. So maybe when the new person joins, they met all the paperwork and other requirements. They join. They will be undergoing a structured induction process within the organization. They're issued a handbook, business cards, a desk, some IT equipment, things like that, in order for that employee to get started. And after that step, you have what is called the probation period. Correct? Are you with me on that?
Yes, that was with you.
So you have
yes.
And if the employee is doing well, you find that the person is doing the responsibilities okay. You take some opinions, feedbacks, and at some stage, 4 to 6 weeks, 8 to 12 weeks, depending on the role that you're joining. At some stage, what will happen is the person will get confirmed within that position or confirmed within that contract to work with as an employee within the organization. So your probation period ends, your trial period ends, and you become what is called a permanent employee of the organization. And some of the other benefits that you are supposed to receive then become receivable. Things like, say, for example, annual holidays, if you have a health insurance or dental care insurance benefits which are coming along with the rule, which have been described in the contract, then become fully receivable to the employee who is actually got confirmed. Is that okay?
Yes.
So when we look at this particular process, what I've taken you through very briefly is the process of recruitment and selection, which helps us clearly understand the role of HR within the organization. And I've just picked up one of the facets of the HR role, which is just looking at recruitment and selection. So how does this work? It works through the process of something called HRP, Human Resources Planning. Is that okay? That bit looks covering, the what do you call the assessment criteria 2.1. What is that process? That is human resources planning process. Right? Now we look at roles within the HR, and when we talk about the roles within the HR, we are talking about different roles. Recruitment and selection, we are talking about training, we are talking about development, we are talking about compensation, rewards, performance, talent management. These are different roles within the HR that we need to concentrate on, and what we look at in that particular role is that these roles are important for the HR department to function. You cannot have just one HR manager. If it's a small organization, depending on the operation, that person might be doing payroll towards the end of the month, maybe recruiting one odd employee across the year, might be doing some other trainings, other functions like training and development. But in this case, it is not being done by the employee, but it is outsourced. So what the person does in that role is, if there's a training requirement that comes up, he finds the recruitment, he finds the relevant agency in the market, and the employees go out and do the training. But if it's an organization of sizable operation, and this function is within the organization, then one of the roles which HR or one of the strategic roles of HR managers would be to manage training and development and staff and employees within the organization. Is that okay?
Yes.
And that would cover, your assessment criteria too. So here, after explaining the process of human resources planning, what we want to be able to do is basically talk about, when it says roles, we are talking about at least two roles or two important functions which the HR performs within the organization, which are critical. One could be recruitment and selection, second could be training and development. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
And the third bit is, we talk about how this is implemented within the organization. So in some cases, you will see that if it's a small operation, as I mentioned earlier, you will see that the organization will outsource the training to a third party or a company, because they do not have the requisite resources to be able to run training for their employees within the organization. A typical example is that every year you will see health and safety training, fire marshal, first aider trainings. They are quickly outsourced because you go in for half a day training, and that person or the persons which are responsible for taking up that voluntary role or that role within the organization, they get this training because they need to be updated. And instead of doing it in-house, they send you to a specialist agency or an organization, and the HR identifies that. They normally have a contract with that organization, and what they do is, from time to time, they keep sending the employees who need to get trained, and that training tends to happen, on an outsourced basis. But here, the implementation of that training or that requirement is primarily done through a third-party agency. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
So here, in the third assessment criteria, what we need to be able to do is basically talk about a particular function, and then in that show how the implementation of that is done from an HR perspective. So you might have a plan as a department manager that I want my staff to get trained on GDPR, for example. Now, GDPR, when it was introduced last year, most employees, most organizations would deal with a lot of data, were asked that the employees should be GDPR trained, they should be a data protection officer. So you might make a small table to do this particular task, and in that table you might show that there are so many employees in the organization, and as a department manager, you put a development plan in place, and that development plan was to look at GDPR training, but within the health and social care settings, you also look at other trainings like safeguarding, you look at prevent, you look at, some of the other mandatory trainings which the employees have to go through. And what you do is, as a manager, have a plan for that. And with that plan, you make sure that people are getting relevant trainings or are going on relevant trainings from time to time, so that they have the relevant knowledge, skills, and the certification in some cases required to be able to effectively deliver in that particular role. And that is implementation of, a particular plan that you can show, which is just related to training and development. Is that okay?
That's okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So with this, we cover the learning outcome 2, which I would summarize as we need to understand the process of human resource planning. Just like planning, which happens in any other department, any other, department within the organization, we need to look at understanding the process of HRP from a perspective of human resources. So human resources planning, what are the key functions human resources department does, and then why these functions are strategic or important within the organization. If you don't have the right recruitment happening, you don't recruit the right employee, right person for the right kind of role, then the organization cannot achieve that objective. So you have to explain that with the example of one critical function of HR. And towards the end, maybe have a small implementation plan to show, just like I've given an example of GDPR, to show that if you're a department manager or if you're a manager managing a number of people, there could be trainings that you put a plan into to get the employees trained or get your staff trained. You put a plan, and that plan is shown as an implementation plan that, okay, this is required to be done, this is required to be done, and this is when the timeline for that planning would be, or the people would go and attend those trainings at that point in time. Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
Any questions on this so far?
No.
So we just choose one of the key functions.
Yes.
And work on that as 2.3.
That's correct, yes. So training and development is a good take on that you can pick up, and that could be easy for you to explain because you're a department head or you're the manager, you have lots of people, and say for example CPD that we manage sometimes, and that is reviewed during the performance appraisal. But within that CPD, you decide as a manager, you have a clear input, sorry, I beg your pardon, clear input into what CPD has to be done in order for that responsibility to be effectively delivered. And because you have that responsibility, you have that creation of that CPD, and which is reviewed at the end of the year in performance appraisal, you decide what trainings the employee needs to do or the staff needs to do under you, which is a part of who are a part of your team, and that will show implementation. But picking up one function like training and development to show that planning.
Okay.
Is that okay?
That's fine. Are you going to send out the whole of this presentation to us?
This presentation is already on Moodle, but what I'm going to do is send you a new version along with one handout which will define, which is already there, I think, but which will give you a good reading in terms of, what is the full process that we've talked about.
Lovely. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to just quickly pause recording.